Now anything we say is being archived, so I'll do my best to behave. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about our presenter today. It's Adam Smith. He is the EAA Vice President of Membership. And Adam, you can see in the picture there, sitting in the Supermarine Seafire. It's a picture that I believe he posed for strictly to make me jealous, and it certainly worked. You can see on the left the list of bullets there. Adam is responsible for a number of programs serving all of EAA membership, including our publications, so Sport Aviation, the Division magazines, our electronic publications, the E-Hotline newsletter that tonight's just went out about a half an hour ago. Adam also oversees our chapters, the operations of the AirVenture Museum, and also the AirVenture features and attractions. Last year, and certainly as we expect him to coming up in 2011, Adam will probably do a couple of presentations leading up to this summer's big AirVenture event, teasing us and giving us some advanced looks at what's going to be coming. So if there's a cool airplane coming to Oshkosh for the event in the summer, Adam is the guy that knows about it. Adam is also an avid pilot with a couple of great airplanes. He's got his 1946 clipped wing Cub and a 55 Cessna 180, and he is steadily building a World War I Sopwith Pup replica. That's something that we're certainly excited to see and watch that get in the air. So in just a moment here, I will be bringing Adam on board as a presenter. I'll be turning it over to him shortly here. Okay, Adam, you are live and presenting.
Thank you, Hal, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and hopefully you're looking forward to what I expect will be about an hour-long presentation, where we're going to take a look at all of these claims that exist all around the world about the idea that someone might have made a powered flight before the Wright brothers. Before I get going, I would like to say hello to someone who emailed me this afternoon. Her name is Ann Emerson, and in her email she told me she was 96 years old, but would be tuning in this evening. So I did want to say a special hello to you, Ann, and well done to you for being at a computer watching a webinar at age 96, because I've certainly encountered many people much younger than you who are a little bit scared of the webinar technology, so welcome. Okay, let's get going here. Tomorrow is December 17th, and of course that's the anniversary of the first powered flight by the Wright brothers, and here on your screen you have a photograph of that moment. And let's just take a moment to reflect on what an amazing photograph this really is. It's probably the first time in history that an epoch-shattering moment was captured on a photograph. I can't think of anything else like this where, I mean, this is it. This is the first powered flight that the Wright brothers made on December 17th, 1903. They didn't just get a photograph of it, they got a great photograph. Look how well composed it is, and it's Orville at the controls and Wilbur running alongside him. And you know, this is one of the most reproduced photographs in the history of the world. And rightfully so, I think. I'm going to lay my cards on the table right away, folks. Personally, I believe that this was the moment, a very, very important event in world history. I am a great admirer of the Wright brothers and everything they accomplished. But it is true to say that probably millions of people around the world don't agree with what I just said. They believe that someone in their country, or even in their state, in the USA, made a powered flight before the Wrights. So the goal of my presentation this evening is to sort of take you on a little journey through some of those stories. I don't present myself as a big academic or scholarly historian here. As Hal explained, I sort of work for EAA, but this has been a passion of mine for quite a long time, and one of the things I will do is start by telling you how it became an interest of mine from my past back in Scotland. But it's a story of invention, and if you
pardon me, Adam.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt, even when I promised I would only do so politely. But you and I had spoken. I do have a poll prepared, and we had thought that we might want to ask that at the beginning and the end. So if now's a good time, or whenever that's appropriate for you, I can.
Hal, before I launch off, this would be a great time to run the poll.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that right now, and we'll ask everyone to take a moment and take their pick. So do you think there were any successful powered heavier-than-air flights before the Wright brothers' success in 1903? And please select all that apply. Maybe I need to go back to poll creating school. Please only select one answer when you vote. My apologies for not figuring that out a little bit better. We're getting a lot of answers coming in already.
Hal, you will need to read the answers out to me because I can't see that slide that you've
got. My apologies. So the choices that we've given them in response to that question are yes, I'm sure of it, no, Wilbur and Orville were indisputably first, and undecided.
Okay.
And we've got 87% of precincts reporting so far. Adam, do you want to hear the answers now, or do you want that to be a surprise at the end?
Yeah, please. What we'll do is read them out now. Let's get the result, and then at the end of the presentation, let's see if we've changed anybody's mind. Okay,
terrific. So, in response to the question, was anyone successful at the powered heavier-than-air flight before the Wrights? 17% have said yes, that they're sure of it. 47% have said no, Wilbur and Orville were indisputably first, and the remaining 40% are undecided.
Okay, so almost the majority of people, actually the majority of people don't believe the Wright brothers did it or aren't sure. So we got some work to do this evening, Hal.
I believe that we do. And I look forward to you taking on the lion's share of that. If I sit here and soak it up.
All right. I'm motivated.
And it is back to you, Adam.
Okay. I typed the word invention into Google image search to see what came up, and I was hoping that I would find a photograph of a light bulb, and indeed right there at the top of the search was a photograph of a light bulb. A light bulb is, if you think about the concept of invention, we often use it pictorially, and why do we do that? Because I think it's often used as an example of an invention, and when I speak to American audiences, they're very aware that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. But you speak to any British person, like myself, will say, the heck he did. Joseph Swan invented the light bulb. And indeed, if you look in the historical record, a year before Thomas Edison came out with his light bulb, Joseph Swan in England patented the incandescent electric light bulb, and Thomas Edison never sold the light bulb in Britain because he was defeated in the law courts, and Joseph Swan had primacy. And this is a story that is repeated throughout history in lots of different technologies. If you want to have a debate about who invented the steam engine, that will get very passionate between the folks in Scotland who thought James Watt did it and the folks in England who believe in several English people that were involved in that journey. And if you go through the history of television, or who invented the telephone, or even, you know, in the modern age, we just had this movie, The Social Network. It really is about who invented Facebook. Throughout the history of technology, you'll often find these raging debates about who came first. And oftentimes, I think in the history of technology, things don't often just spring out of nothing. There's often a gathering of knowledge, and lots of different people are trying things that are kind of moving society towards a goal. And I think one of the messages that you'll get tonight is that don't imagine that the Wright brothers just popped out of thin air and invented an airplane. There were actually quite a lot of people in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, quite a lot of people around the world who knew that an aeroplane was sort of coming and were working towards that goal. But the question before us tonight is who got there first and who made the first powered controlled flight? Well, I got interested in this basically in my previous job, I was the curator of the National Museum of Flight in Scotland. This is a nice aerial photograph of East Fortune Airfield, which is just outside of Edinburgh. And if you ever go up there, if you ever visit Scotland, do make a visit to the museum. It's a great place, and the museum is just over here. I'm highlighting it. It's about 60 acres of a large World War II airfield. In fact, it was a World War I airfield as well. So I'd spent the early part of my life working in different museums, and I ended up in an aviation museum and got, of course, interested in the history of aviation in Scotland. And as with lots of countries, Scotland's got its own great story of aviation. Just 1 year after the Montgolfier brothers, a guy called James Tytler flew a hot air balloon in Edinburgh. And here we've got an inventor in Glasgow called Joseph Kaufman, who invented this incredible flying machine. It's a flapping wing aircraft in 1868. I don't think it ever flew. He had a 20 horsepower engine, a steam engine, and it was 8,000 pounds in weight and had flapping wings. And I think he tried to build it, but I'm pretty sure it never flew. And here's one from the university I attended in Scotland, in St Andrews, the home of golf. It was also the home of James Bell Pettigrew, who was, he actually published a book in the 1860s on the flight of birds. He studied the aerodynamics of bird flight, and that was actually one of the reference books that the Wright brothers used in their early research. But James Bell Pettigrew in Scotland tried to build this incredible ornithopter. He broke his leg trying to fly it, but he was another of the early inventors in Scotland. And here we have Percy Pilcher, who really did fly, as you can see from the photograph here. A little bit like Otto Lilienthal, the German. He built hang gliders, and this one, the Hawk, which dates from 1896, still survives and was and still is displayed in the National Museum of Flight in Scotland. Pilcher is quite interesting because after Lilienthal, he was the second person to be killed in a flying accident. In 1899, he lost his life when he flew the Hawk on a day when the wings had got wet in a rainstorm, and it structurally collapsed, and he was killed, which was a real shame because at the time he was working on a powered airplane, and you can see a side view of it here. So even as early as 1899, Pilcher had a gas-powered aircraft with a propeller in it, and people in Scotland often wonder if Pilcher might have made the first powered flight if he had lived. And indeed, a few years ago, a group of students actually built a replica of one of Pilcher's powered aircraft, and they flew it, although I'm not sure what if that exactly proves a lot, but it proves that maybe he was close. So here I am working in the Museum of Scotland, interested in all this stuff, and one day I got a copy of the Daily Record, which is the biggest selling newspaper in Scotland, and this article jumped right out at me. Flying Scot beat the Wright flight. Wow, I have never heard of this one. It really caught my attention. And basically the story was that a fellow called James Preston Watson, who lived in the city of Dundee on the east coast of Scotland, in the summer of 1903, built an aeroplane and flew it under power. Wow. So I got interested in this story and started looking into it in a little bit more detail. And sure enough, you find this story in the historical record. And the first mention I can ever find of it anywhere is in 1953, on the exact 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight. There was a big dinner in London held by the Royal Aeronautical Society, and it was a dinner designed to celebrate the 50th anniversary of powered flight. And this dinner was kind of gate-crashed by the brother of James Preston Watson, and he sort of stormed in the room and said, "This is all a sham. My brother flew before the Wright brothers a powered airplane." And there were quite a lot of newspaper stories and articles written about it at the time. So, well, what's behind all this? Well, James Preston Watson certainly was a real person, and there's a photograph of him in ironically, a Wright aeroplane in World War I when he was learning to fly in the Royal Flying Corps. James Preston Watson, actually, he was a very accomplished young man. He played rugby for Scotland and joined the Royal Flying Corps, and he was tragically killed in a training accident in World War I. Actually, I don't know if you all know this, but 2 or 3 times as many young pilots were killed in World War I in training accidents as were killed in combat. That was the sort of nature of aviation at the time. We built a lot of dangerous airplanes and weren't very good at teaching people how to fly them. So he is a real person, definitely flew, and this is a photograph of the airplane that his brother alleged that he flew in the summer of 1903. So it looks like an airplane. It's I've got a highlighter tool I can bring up here. It's got just a regular wing, and then a sort of strange rocking wing that sort of sits on the top there and sort of pivots, and that was his control mechanism. And here's the only other photograph that I could find of the Watson airplane. This is a little bit more blurry. I ended up spending a lot of time in the archives of Dundee Library up in Scotland, and this journey also took me to the patent office in England, and I really got interested in sort of trying to track down the truth of this, because wow, it would be really interesting if a Scotsman had flown before the Wright brothers. Well, here's a patent that James Preston Watson submitted to the Patent Office in 1907. How do I describe this? This doesn't look like a practical flying machine to me, and I think probably not you either. What we've got going on here is almost like windmills. These things are going to travel round in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction, and somehow I guess his idea was they would provide lift and the thing would fly. I don't think this would have flown at all. I also found a 1909 patent. Now this looks much more familiar. It is in fact the aeroplane that you saw in the photographs, with a couple of subtle differences. If you're looking closer, you probably see this one is on skids, whereas the aeroplane you saw in the photograph was on wheels. But this is the same aircraft. So I'm getting a bit suspicious now about whether this airplane flew in 1903, when clearly his mind in 1907 was in a different place, and when in 1909 he gets to this point. And if I just go back a little bit, when we start to really look at this aircraft closely, we can take a look and identify the engine that was powering it. And this it really is a smoking gun, because this is a French engine that was built in 1907, and that's a historical fact, and was certainly not in production in 1903. So we have, I think, when we start to piece all this together, we're starting to get a pretty cast iron case that this aircraft could not possibly have flown before the Wright brothers. And then finally I was researching in Flight magazine, which has been published since 1909 continuously, and found an article about the airplane that was published, I think, in 1914. In fact, yeah, 1914. And in James Preston Watson's own words, in this article, he recognizes that the Wright brothers, as you can see from the quote, were the first to fly in a practical way. And in fact, the article goes on to say, to explain how Preston Watson had actually devised this rocking wing mechanism, which again you can sort of see here on this photograph. He actually devised that as a way of sidestepping the Wright brothers' patent on control of an aircraft. So this is pretty open close in my opinion now. And I went one evening to Dundee, and I was invited to give a talk about James Preston Watson. And I sort of entitled my talk 12 Good Reasons Why James Preston Watson Could Not Possibly Have Flown Before the Wright Brothers. And there were a couple of hundred people in the audience, and I gave them all my evidence and information. And at the end of the presentation, I said, okay, is there anyone in the audience that still believes James Preston Watson flew before the Wright brothers? And I was just stunned because fully half of the hands in the room went up. I'm like, where am I going wrong? And a guy in the audience said to me, Mr. Smith, you didn't understand the Dundee psyche. And that was a real lesson to me because, and I think it's something that is applicable to several of these stories that we'll look at this evening, because however strong the evidence, and in historical terms, this one is open and shut. There is no way that he flew before the Wright brothers. But in historical terms, that might be true. But when you bring people's passion and emotion into it, and their pride of their family or their nation or their region, then that can twist people's perceptions of situations. So a few observations before we move on, just on the story that I told you. First of all, people really like to debunk a commonly held view. I think you all know that from your experience in society. The conspiracy theory is a very compelling thing. I think we probably all find ourselves doing it at some point, whatever the subject. And I think that has sort of taken hold of the aeroplane story a little bit. People would just love the idea that they might have a bit of inside information or a little bit of knowledge that debunks the received wisdom. Usually in these stories there's usually just enough sort of source material to keep the story going. So with James Preston Watson he was flying, or he was trying to, and there is enough in the way of photographs and bits and pieces of information to pull it together into something that's sort of plausible. I've put the fallibility of human memory. One of the things that James Preston Watson's brother did in the 50s and 60s, he went around and he got people to make signed witness statements and affidavits that they had seen his brother fly in the summer of 1903. And people would write things like, I swear that I was married in November of 1903, and I definitely saw him fly before then. Therefore, this is true. And human memory is something that's interested me my whole life. The first job I ever had was interviewing veterans and survivors of World War I. In the late 1980s, I did a lot of that, talking to people about their experiences in World War I. And comparing what they told me to historical facts really gave me an understanding of how the human memory works. And the human memory can often recall things extremely well. But when you start asking the human memory to recall specific dates and specific things that people said, it can often be extremely flawed. And that's something I've learned from my work in history in general. And I think that often applies to these stories where several decades after the event, people are being asked to remember very, very specific things. So James Preston Watson's brother, he got a witness statement from a baker who was adamant that his brother came into his bakery and brought in some pieces of bamboo, and they put them in the baker's oven, and they baked them to sort of heat them up and bend them, and he put them on his aeroplane. I absolutely believe that happened. No question that he was in that baker's shop. But when that baker said, and it definitely happened in the summer of 1903, that's when it falls apart a little bit for me. And as I mentioned, you've got this issue of pride that often, I think, clouds people's judgment over facts, and I think you'll see that as we go through the presentation. Anyway, I better get moving on here. Okay, I am going to start flying through some of the different claimants that are out there. This one's from France, 1874, a guy called Felix du Temple, did build a steam-powered aircraft. I've never seen a photograph of it. I've seen a couple of illustrations, but this one's pretty clear, right? It's got a propeller at the front and wings and an engine, and okay, it looks like an airplane. There is I think he's not one of the most controversial people. There's a sort of weak claim that that he hopped into the air with the steam-powered airplane sometime around 1874. But he's not one of the more controversial figures that like lots and lots of people bring his name up all the time. A little bit more controversy about Alexander Moshievsky, the Russian. A little bit later, 1884. He was quite a well-off aristocratic, from an aristocratic naval kind of a family, and reasonably good documentation. He was interested in aviation, kite flying, things like that. He was given a grant to develop an aircraft, and there is a contemporary engraving of it. Again, steam-powered, as were most of the airplanes in this early period. It's sort of unusual that you would see a picture of an airplane belching black smoke like that. So I think we can establish that he took this thing down a ramp, maybe a ski jump kind of a ramp, tried to fly it. I think, in my opinion, it's likely it didn't fly at all and flopped off the end. But not much was said about this guy until after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, when it became important for the Russians to promote their national identity and their own accomplishments, particularly in comparison to the capitalist West. And so Moshievsky was sort of adopted by the communists as a great hero. They sort of changed his identity a little bit. Although he was from an aristocratic family, of course that was unacceptable. So he was presented as a humble sailor who had invented an airplane before those capitalist Wright brothers. And here you see a couple of postage stamps from the 60s and 70s that proclaim his achievement. And I think there's still a legacy of this in Russia and that part of the world where children were brought up on this story. But I don't think there are many serious historians that give this one a lot of credence. But, he was still out there trying to build an airplane. Okay, here's one from France, Clement Ader. And this one's got a little bit more traction. Another postage stamp here from France. It says Precursor de l'aviation, precursor of aviation. Another steam-powered airplane. I think Ader was an interesting guy, an inventor not just of airplanes but of other things. And in 1890, I think it's entirely possible that he got his steam-powered airplane off the ground. He might have hopped it in the air a couple of feet off the ground, and he might have gone 50 feet, 100 feet max, something like that. I will grant that. It was certainly an uncontrolled flight. I don't think he had a control mechanism at all, and the flight, if it happened, ended in a crash. But I think there's probably enough out there for us to say, yeah, that might have happened. Now, Ader himself didn't really ever credit this as a true flight, but he did continue in his experiments. So this is a wonderful side view of the first aircraft that he built, and just imagine yourself sitting in that. Remember, it's steam powered, so you've got a lot of complex machinery in there, and I guess you're feeding it with coke, and I just can't imagine the trepidation that he must have felt trying to fly that thing. The engine he had actually survives. It's in the French National Museum at Le Bourget, and the engine is actually a little miracle in terms of how to get a lot of power out of a very lightweight steam engine. But he got some government money. He was sort of encouraged enough that he got some military funding to go and build another aeroplane. In fact, he as you'll see, this one's titled the Avion 3. I don't think he ever completed numbers 1 and 2, but he certainly did complete number 3. As you probably know, avion is the French word for aeroplane, and I think that comes directly from Ada and his work. He sort of created the French word for aeroplane through what he did. In 1897, he did some military trials with this aircraft, and by the way, the aircraft does survive in France. You can go and see it in Paris, and just look at that. What an amazing thing it is to see. You can see very clearly how strongly influenced he was by the wings of a bat. He has almost replicated the wing structure, the bone structure of a bat in his aircraft. So these military trials, being military trials, were very, very closely documented, and he never received any more money, and he sort of disappeared for quite a few years. And then in 1906, Ada popped up and he said, "Hey, back in 1897 at those military trials, I flew. I got off the ground and I made, I think it was a 300-meter flight, and I claimed to be the first person to make a powered and controlled flight." This aircraft, by the way, did have a control mechanism out there on the bony wing. And Ada produced a couple of witnesses who stepped forward and said, "Yes, I saw it happen. I saw it happen. This definitely happened." And a Frenchman flew first before anyone else did. So that one really did boil on for quite a number of years, until I think it was the late 1920s when the report that was done at the time by the military was released. I guess it was under secrecy for a while, but when the report was released, it was absolutely crystal clear that Ada never flew in 1897. The report describes how they followed the tracks of the aircraft on the ground, and there was no interruption in the tracks. The wheels could not possibly have left the ground, and so that was pretty open and shut, I guess. And in some ways, is a little bit of a stain on Ada's reputation, because I think he was an interesting person, and with his first aeroplane did some interesting things, but by, I think, quite clearly falsely claiming something, as I say, I think he maybe put a bit of a stain on his reputation. However, when I talked earlier about millions of people believing things, a lot of French people still believe that a Frenchman flew before the Wright brothers. I mean, I was at a conference a few years ago, and the director, the head guy of the French National Aviation Museum at Le Bourget, stood up and said exactly that. That the French beat the Wright brothers to it. So whatever the facts of the case, there is still a real, I guess this one's a national pride issue. Okay, Hiram Maxim, American-born, but later moved over to England. Very well known as I guess the inventor of the modern machine gun, and became extremely wealthy for having done so. But he was also a very curious-minded sort of person, and spent a lot of time and money trying to build aeroplanes. And here you have one that he built in 1894. It's absolutely enormous. It was 8,000 pounds in weight, and I think you can just see in the foreground there's a human being next to it, just to give you a sense of proportion. It's not a lot of controversy about this one. It's a curiosity, I think, in aviation history, because he never really tried to fly it in free flight. If you look closely, it is sitting on rails. So first of all, you've got some rails down the center here, which are just like railroad tracks. But you also have this rail on either side, one here, one here. Now what that is a restraining rail. So if you imagine the aircraft is going to come down the railroad track, but it can't actually take off because when it gets about a foot off the ground here, it's going to be restrained and stopped. It's going to be stopped from flying upwards by this restraining rail. So they were testing this, as he called it, a test rig, and they were testing concepts of lift, but not really trying to fly free because of this restraining rail. But some people say that this aircraft was capable of flight because it certainly did, as it went down the track, lift off that central rail and restrained by the other rail, sort of travel along for quite a long period of time. And Maxim calculated that he had an 8,000 pound airplane, but he calculated that he was getting 10,000 pounds of lift. So, some people advanced at least the idea that that this was an aircraft capable of flight if they'd allowed it. But as you can see from the photograph, this one, there was a day where the upper restraining rail actually broke, presumably because of the lifting power of the test rig, and the whole thing was destroyed. But while we're talking about Hiram Maxim, we have to talk about this little thing just before we leave him. The oldest amusement ride in the whole of Britain dates to 1904, and it's called Hiram Maxim's Captive Flying Machines, and it was installed at Blackpool in 1904, and it's still going strong today. So if you're ever up in the county of Lancashire on the west coast of the northwest coast of England, go and take a ride in one of Hiram Maxim's flying machines. Wilhelm Kress, Austria, 1901. Okay, I don't think there is a strong claim advanced for this guy that he made much of a flight. It was, he definitely an established fact that he's built this thing, and in 1901 he's tried to fly it from water. He had it on floats, and a little bit like Hiram Maxim's thing, I think people sort of advanced the idea that if he hadn't been restrained by water and had actually tried to fly it from land, he probably would have got in the air. But I don't think we'll ever know. I think there are some folks in Austria who are very proud of what he did, but they're probably not making huge claims that he flew before the Wright brothers. All right, we're stateside now. We have a Californian, Lyman Gilmore Jr. As you can see from the photograph, sort of a slightly oddball character. He looks like some escapee from ZZ Top or something. He never shaved, never cut his hair because he feared it may weaken him. He wore a heavy trench coat even in the height of summer, and I think was one of these archetypal crazy inventors. But certainly for a long time he claimed that he had built an aircraft and flown it in 1902. So here's something from the Patent Office, dated 1898, so for sure he's thinking about aircraft. And here we have a photograph of what is pretty much the same aircraft that's in the patent drawing, although which shows it under construction, although this is, I think, this particular photograph is pretty well documented to 1908. So I think, bearing in mind the guy's character and some of his track record in terms of other claims of things that he did, he claimed that he had discovered an enormous gold mine in the Californian hills and things like that. I think he was sort of an eccentric guy. I don't think, other than his own claims, there is any evidence that he flew in 1902. Although it is said that he founded an airfield there in 1907, and I think that's a matter of historical record. So, interesting guy, but I don't think there's a lot of strong evidence telling us that he made a flight. So, sorry, listeners in California, I'm giving that one the thumbs down. And also, now I must defend the great state of Texas too, because I don't think much of your claim either. Sorry. there is the Reverend Canyon's Ezekiel airship. Here's a replica of it in a museum in a town called Pittsburgh, Texas. Wow, look at that. Well, certainly, you know, he was, again, a real person with real ideas in 1902. Here's the stock certificate for the Ezekiel Airship Manufacturing Company, and I think it is a matter of historical fact that he sold all $20,000 worth of shares in his company that was formed for the purpose of building a flying machine. Here's a historical marker from Texas. I guess it's coming out a little bit blurry on the slide here, but I guess it describes the aircraft and suggests that in 1902 it flew in Texas. I mean, just looking at it, I have no idea how this thing could possibly have flown. It doesn't seem credible to me on a basic engineering level. It's, if you look at it, you've got some, I guess, some paddle kind of arrangements, which I suppose the idea was they were going to create some lift and get the thing off the ground. His written description of what it could do, I think, says that it would take off like a regular airplane, as we know a regular airplane would take off today, and would land like a helicopter, a vertical landing. So I have absolutely no idea how this thing aerodynamically could possibly have done that. So I'm afraid, personally, I'm giving this one the thumbs down too. Alright, here's one that some of you may have heard of, because I think this is one of the more well-known and sort of persistent claims that's out there. Gustav Whitehead from Connecticut, although some know him as Gustav Weisskopf because he was a German immigrant, and this fellow's got supporters on both sides of the Atlantic. Certainly many people in Germany like to feel that a German born flew before the Wright brothers, and as I say, this one's, you know, got a little bit going for it, in the sense that, first of all, as you can see from the photograph, he definitely built an aircraft and flew it, and it's one of the few where we actually have photographic evidence that he flew his 1901 hang glider. But the controversy and the discussion really focuses around this aircraft called number 21, and I think this claim has got a couple of things that sort of help it to sustain it. First of all, the aircraft itself, sort of, you know, it looks credible. I've dismissed a couple of the previous ones, haven't I? Maybe cruelly, but by just saying, you know the old adage in aviation, if it looks right, it'll fly right. Well, some of these other aircraft, you just know they weren't going to fly. This one, though, I think you can imagine it flying, and although I don't have a lot of slides of it, if you see it from other angles, it just sort of has an aeroplane-y look about it. So you could believe that it could fly. But really, the biggest thing that Whitehead's got going for him is that there are contemporary newspaper accounts that say that describe him flying, and no historian can avoid that fact that in 1902 you can look up quite a number of regional newspapers that give a description of an actual flight by him. So this story was pretty much buried until I think it was 1934 that this book was published, The Lost Flights of Gustav Whitehead. And I think it really brought this story to life, and it quoted the newspaper accounts, and brought those to life, and also brought forth a few people who went on the record and said, yes, I was there, I saw him fly, so on and so forth. So what's going on with this one? I think this one's got a little bit of a different character than some of the stories we've been hearing, because we've got contemporary evidence, and there just seems to be more to it. Well, first of all, I don't think in a few minutes summary of this one that I can possibly settle a raging argument. I need to. I'll tell you what I think. I don't think he flew. I think the guy was a charlatan, confidence trickster kind of guy. I think that it's very meaningful that none of the people who invested in him ever felt that he flew, that his wife said that he never flew. I can get comfortable with the idea that newspaper reporting of that time was not the same as it is today, and that newspapers may have published a story supplied to them by Whitehead that was written as though it was a first-person account of a flight. That's my opinion. I know other people have very strong opinions in the other direction. I think the purpose of me this evening is to, if you weren't familiar with it, you might want to go and look it up on the web or grab some of the books that have been written on the subject. Here's a replica of his aircraft that definitely flew, as you can see. Although, as with the other one we talked about earlier, I'm not sure it means a lot when you're using modern engines and modern propellers. That's Gustav Whitehead. Oh, here's another biggie. Okay, at least half the population of New Zealand, if not more, thinks a New Zealander flew before the Wright brothers. His name was Richard Pierce, and the claim is that in I think it's March 31st, 1903, that he flew before the Wrights. Again, this one was pretty much a buried story, but started to come forth in the 1960s, and there was these relics of his aircraft were actually dug up on an archaeological expedition in the 1960s. You can see on the left his propeller, and on the right the remains of his four-cylinder engine. Here you've got a monument, and well, I don't need to read it out for you, but you can see that there's a monument commemorating a heavy first powered flight of a heavier-than-air machine. Again, we've got a postage stamp. This one was put out by the New Zealand government, or the New Zealand Post Office, in 1903, celebrating first powered flight in New Zealand. And a lot of people on March 31st, 1903 celebrated the centennial of aviation. Peter Jackson, the Lord of the Rings director, he made a film about this too, that you may have seen or may have heard of. What's going on with this one? Well, for me, first of all, I'm gonna bring up a couple of quotes that he himself made. Okay, I don't think there's any question that Richard Pierce claims that he flew before the Wright brothers. As you'll see from the first quote there, from a newspaper in 1915, he is quite clearly crediting the Wright brothers of having made the first flight. And in this article from 1928, a little bit later in his life, again, he's basically saying he never even flew in his first aircraft. So, personal opinion, that's pretty compelling when the person himself is sort of pretty clearly denying it. And whenever I've got into arguments with New Zealanders about this, and they will argue with you about it, and they sort of say, well, he didn't know what he was saying, or yes, he went a bit mad later in life, and he was so shy he denied things that really he had done. I'm not so sure, folks. Again, I'm being a little bit jokey, but I'm very respectful of everyone's opinion. But my personal view is, I don't think he flew, and I think if you actually again go into the detail of it, even if he did fly, he was flying downhill, and I'm not sure for me that really counts as a sustained flight if you're heading downhill. And so we'll give the Kiwi a little nod there, but it's Adam's thumbs down, I'm afraid. Samuel Langley, 1903. Okay. Well, here in the EAA Museum we have a beautiful replica of this little model. Back in the early 1890s, Langley had some real success with with small models and model flight, and he was given a $50,000 grant to develop a full-sized aircraft. And this is a relatively well-known story because he tried to fly it a couple of times in 1903, and both of them were well documented and ended in catastrophe, really. This is the first one. You can see the aircraft is just about to take a nosedive into the Potomac River. And this one, a few days before the Wright brothers' flight, was even worse. As they launched the aircraft from the boat there, it had a structural failure. Well, Langley's aircraft never flew. I don't think anybody claims that it did. Actually, I got a slide here of the engine. That was a really cool engine, ahead of its time. It was a 52 horsepower, 5-cylinder radial engine. That was about 10 years ahead of anything in aviation. It was a little bit sad that the airplane was such a big failure, because it meant the engine didn't get the attention that it probably deserved. But Langley is sort of controversial, not because anyone's claiming that the aircraft flew, but sort of what came afterwards. First of all, as you probably know, Glenn Curtiss got into a huge patent struggle with the Wright brothers over who'd invented the airplane, control mechanisms and things like that. And he actually took Langley's original aircraft and put it on floats and flew it to demonstrate that it had been capable of flight. And it was a bit disingenuous, really, because Curtiss really modified the aircraft and put control systems on it that were never on the original and things like that. But I think probably the most controversial thing was that the Smithsonian Institution, who Langley had been the secretary of, displayed this aircraft for many years with a caption on it saying that this was the first aircraft in the history of the world that had been capable of flight. And that really annoyed the Wright brothers, and justifiably so, I think. And it annoyed them to an extent. It's not very well known, but the Wright Flyer, the original Kitty Hawk Wright Flyer, was not displayed in the National Collection in Washington until after World War II. It was actually displayed in the Science Museum in London, because the Wright brothers were so annoyed that credit was being given to Langley when they felt it wasn't due. And it was only during World War II that the Smithsonian agreed to note the Wright brothers as being making the first powered flight. So they did a deal, and after World War II they pulled it out of the Welsh mountain that it had been hidden in to avoid the German bombs, and it came back over to America. But I told that story at length because there was a contract between the Wright brothers and the Smithsonian, and some of the claimants for these other people, like Gustav Whitehead's adherents, always look at this contract and say, look, there's a contract that says that the Smithsonian must for all of time recognize the Wright brothers as being the inventors of the airplane. And the contract does say that. Therefore, they're not allowed to recognize anyone else, so it's all a sham. So there's always a bit of controversy hiding in these things. Now here's an interesting one. Karl Jatho, Hanover, Germany. This one was pretty much completely unknown until in the 1960s a group of photographs and documents came to light in Hanover, and that documented in reasonable detail the experiments of this guy called Karl Jatho. And this one sort of interests me because a lot of the information that I've given you this evening I've pulled straight from the work of a guy called Charles Gibbs Smith, and go and look his books up if you like aviation history. He's one of the great writers on aviation history. He's been deceased for a number of years now, but when he was in his prime, he wrote some fantastic historical works on the early years of aviation. And Charles Gibbs Smith, he sort of set himself up as being sort of a protector of the Wright brothers' legacy. He was an Englishman and worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Interestingly, he never flew in his whole life, but he was just this great he really understood aviation and was really wonderful at writing about it. And whenever one of these claims popped up that someone flew before the Wright brothers, man, Charles Gibbs Smith would just jump on them. And he wrote a whole book about Clement Ader, and James Preston Watson, who the Scotsman I talked about earlier, he really got deep into that and was a great historian in terms of getting to the base facts. Now, it does mean a lot to me that a guy like Charles Gibbs Smith, even he acknowledges that Karl Jatho from Germany probably did fly before the Wright brothers, and that is based upon his scrutiny and investigation of the documentary evidence that was found. His initial reaction, he admitted, was he just thought, oh, here comes another one of these. I'm gonna another fire I've got to put out. But when he looked into it, I think he acknowledged that that Jatho probably made some what we might call hops. He may have got up to 10 feet off the ground, and he may have hopped for 100 feet, something like that. So, and here's a little quote from Jatho from one of the documents that is actually about him, how he's disappointed, but he is referencing that he has made flights of some sort. So, what does that mean? Historical curiosity, or we've got a German who flew before the Wright brothers? Well, we better talk about the Wright brothers, I think, because I think Karl Jatho is a good example of, okay, so here's Adam and here's Charles Gibbs Smith saying, well, maybe he did get off the ground, but I think the question before is that so what? Did it mean anything? Because I think one of the points I really want to try and get across strongly this evening is that even if any of these people made a flight before the Wright brothers, they didn't change the world, and they really had no impact or influence on the course of aviation or world history at all. Because I am absolutely convinced that when you look at airplanes today and you go out in the EAA Museum or the Smithsonian and you look at all those aircraft, you can trace the ancestry of all of them back to one aircraft, which is the Kitty Hawk Wright Flyer. It seems to me that when you do the family tree of aviation, this absolutely is the granddaddy of them all. As you've seen tonight, they didn't pop out of a blue sky and just invent an airplane. They weren't the first people that put an engine on an aircraft, or put propellers on an aircraft, or had a biplane configuration, or whatever it is. Many people were working on aviation at this time. But what the Wright brothers did do that nobody else did is bring it all together into a system that actually worked. Some of the things that the Wright brothers did were just profoundly different and better than anybody else out there. Think of all the aircraft we've seen and the funky propellers on there. The propellers the Wrights invented, just as one component of their aircraft system, were, I think, 82% efficient. And even a modern wooden propeller isn't much better than that. They just took the whole thing to a new level in that one area. And of course, the great gift that the Wright brothers gave to the world and to humanity and to aviation was the gift of control. Although other people were building aircraft with wings and propellers and engines and things like that, nobody devised an effective control mechanism before the Wright brothers did. And here's a good example of what I just said, the issue of control. This is Alberto Santos-Dumont. He's a Brazilian, but he lived in France, and in 1906 he made the first powered flight in Europe. Now at that time, many people thought he'd made the first powered flight in the world, because okay, we'd heard these stories coming over from America, but we don't quite believe them, and there have been other stories before. But when Santos-Dumont definitely made a flight in 1906 in this aircraft. By the way, if you look closely, he's actually facing that way. I think intuitively you think the aeroplane's flying from left to right, but it's actually flying from right to left. It's sort of a back to front, weird looking thing. It doesn't really have an effective control mechanism. He's got this sort of box kite kind of a thing here that was some sort of, it was flexible and he was trying to control it, but he could fly, I think, because he's got this enormous dihedral and no controls at all on his wings. But he got in the air, it was photographed, it was even captured on movie, I think. And he became an absolute hero. You know, he was just feted across the whole of Europe, and I still, every year at Oshkosh, I have Brazilians coming to bug me about, they want to put a statue of him in the museum here at Oshkosh next to the Wright flyer, because the Brazilians are just adamant that he made the first powered flight. And because somehow the Brazilians have got in their head that, yes, they acknowledge that the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, but if we go back to this slide, a little bit later in their development, the Wright brothers developed this system where a weight would drop from the derrick, and when they were flying in Dayton, Ohio, it sort of helped them. It gave them an assisted launch to help them fly from Huffman Prairie out there. Now, they never actually used this at Kitty Hawk. Their takeoffs at Kitty Hawk were entirely unassisted, but the Brazilians don't believe that. They believe that because the Wright brothers used this derrick system, that a Brazilian got there first. And anyway, I respect Santos-Dumont, wonderful character, really one of those great people from the romantic age of aviation, and I respect his achievements, but I don't want to put a statue of him next to the Wright flyer, because I think that sends slightly the wrong message. However, 1906, 3 years after Kitty Hawk, he's flying in Europe, and in 1908, Wilbur Wright takes a Wright flyer over to Europe, and this is one of the seminal moments in world history and in aviation history. The Wright brothers, although they've made this first flight in December of 1903, pretty secretive about it, and had not ever publicly demonstrated their aircraft. And they continued to develop it. I think even the Wright brothers themselves acknowledged that they did not really perfect their aircraft until 1905, and you can go and see that aircraft. The original one still exists in the on display in Dayton. So they developed it, and by 1905 they'd pretty got it locked down, got a good control, and they could do reasonably long sustained flights. And by 1908 they decided they were going to do some public flying because the world was skeptical of their claims, and they decided that was the right thing to do. So Wilbur creates up an airplane, takes it over to a place that's still famous called Le Mans in France, and of course it's famous now for the 24-hour auto race. And he uncrates his airplane, and as you can see here, he sort of slowly assembles it, and then he goes flying, and he absolutely blew everybody away. At that point in history, the longest flight in Europe, by 1908, the longest flight in Europe was less than 2 minutes, and nobody could effectively control an aircraft. They had very rudimentary things. I think someone had just about been able to turn a full circle in the air. And here Wilbur Wright shows up, and he demonstrates that he has complete mastery of the air. He can fly for sustained amounts of time. In fact, by the end of that summer, he had made one flight of over 2 hours in duration. But it was the control. He could swoop, he could turn figure eights, he could turn circles, and to be fair to the people of Europe, they had doubted him, but to be fair, they bowed their heads and said, "You are the master. This is undeniable." And he became a superstar. He visited the kings and queens of Europe, and huge crowds and greeted him wherever he went. It was a little bit like when Lindbergh went over there in 1927. So interestingly, for me, from that moment on, the Wright brothers were not really that influential in aviation history at all, because as soon as they had revealed to the world their big secret, which was really the secret of control, how to control an aircraft, everybody else went, that's how you do it, and blew right by them. And I don't think the Wright brothers technically were ever really, sort of at the forefront from that point on. But what a gift they gave to the world. I think this is just about me wrapping up now, Hal. He took passengers that summer as well. I think this is the first female passenger that he took out there in Le Mans. That's my little run through the early years of aviation. I've expressed my opinions, and Hal, would this be a good time to bring up the poll again?
Absolutely. And as I do that, as soon as I bring up that question, I really thought I was being so very, very careful, but I have to acknowledge one of our listeners tonight, Adam, a gentleman by the name of Neil Patton, who has not been shy about pointing out a couple of things, in particular the wording of the poll question. So let me get this question launched, and I'll explain the clarification here. So we're opening this again. And those are the results. Oh, I apologize. I'm not sure that I can actually open the same question again. I'll tell you what. Let's come back to that, and I'll see if I can recreate that. While I'm working on that, Adam, let me turn the screen just back to yours, and let me ask you to speak to a couple of the other questions that have come in. I mentioned Neil Patton has had some very interesting commentary ongoing, not as much of the very specific questions, but as we were talking about this whole question of sort of who is first, he's really looking for a definition. I'm scrolling back here to make sure that I get it. Is really, how do we define successful? How do we define flight? How do we define powered? How do we really define controlled? And I think through the journey you've answered that, but maybe you can recap. If you were to say, very simply put, that, well, the Wright brothers were successful and these others were not, maybe you can restate your definition and your criteria for success.
Yeah, okay, good question. And I try not to get too sort of technical and wordy in how I present things, and maybe you might all be laughing saying, well, you didn't succeed in that, but...
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing.
but when people ask me to be specific about it, I personally, my definition of success is, first of all, yes, it needs to be successful. These ones that ended in a crash, that doesn't feel very successful to me. So successful, powered. I think it needs to have a motor on it and be capable of sort of sustained flight and control. So having an effective control mechanism. So I think some of the early flights maybe had some aspects of that, maybe particularly the powered, these powered hops off the ground and things like that. I don't know of anyone that invented an effective control mechanism before the Wright brothers, or were close to it, or have anything that would seem to resemble it. And that's why in my closing comments I really tried to emphasize that if you ask me to say, what was the one thing that the Wright brothers did, it was to develop a control mechanism for aviation.
That's excellent. I think that covers it very nicely. Another, was more of a comment, but another one from Neil that he had pointed out, and you addressed this a bit when you were talking about Clement Ader, the steam engine. You had mentioned that, Adam, that it was pretty remarkable, and Neil's comment was that it was more efficient than the Wright engine, pound for pound, and that it was actually also lighter.
And while I didn't know that, I have no reason to doubt it. In fact, of all the things on the original Wright airplane, probably the least impressive thing was their engine. It was enough to get them in the air, but it wasn't. that definitely wasn't a big part of their breakthrough. I think it was some of the other things that they did, like I mentioned the propellers and the control system, that really was the big breakthrough.
Very good. There was a very early question. Actually, and you have to forgive me, Adam, but the very, very first comment that came in simply said, "Hi, Hal." So in response to that, I have to say, "Hi, Russ," and thank him for being out there and for listening tonight. But another question that came in after that, and this is certainly one that's notable in aviation history. This came from Mike Reaney just before we were getting started, and he was asking about the first, what was the first airplane to use ailerons, what year, and where were they first used?
Is it okay to say I don't know?
No, please fabricate an answer. Well, it is sort of a loaded question, because if you're specifically talking hinged ailerons versus a roll mechanism.
Yeah, I used to know the answer of that, and I'm pretty sure it was over in Europe, and probably a Frenchman. Actually, one thing I neglected to mention, when I talk about early aviation history, I usually do like to give a nod to the French, and I should probably balance out some of my comments about Clément Ader, because I actually think that at least until the end of World War I, and probably for a while after that, the French were the most powerful positive force in the development of aviation, without a doubt. And if you don't believe me, go and visit the French National Museum at Le Bourget. It is an amazing museum, and you just cannot believe almost the variety of aircraft and the way this whole nation took aviation to its heart. So you mentioned aileron, and which is a French word, and so many of the words we use in aviation are French in nature, and I think that's just one aspect of how this whole nation really took a hold of it. There was something about, I suppose they were first in the sense that they made the first balloon flight, and I think they always had a bit of a passion for it. But in those early years, it was overall a fantastic hotbed, and I think it wasn't really until Lindbergh's flight and the years that followed that America took over world leadership in aviation development.
Oh, very, very good. So a couple of other comments, and then another question I want to interject. And now I need to apologize, as maybe I've started something. But Adam, there's a gentleman out there named Wayne who has said, "Hi, Hal and Adam," and I believe you can figure out just who that is. So hello for both of us.
Wayne.
Hello, Wayne. On the subject of ailerons, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation tonight that our next webinar is by Fred Stadler, who's talking about the building of our Blériot 11 replica here at EAA and the AirVenture Museum. And Fred has commented, ailerons, listen to my webinar next month. So happy to share Fred's shameless and well-deserved promotion for that next webinar. So those of you that are interested in that, particularly you, Mike, who asked that question early on, be sure to sign up for the webinar next month. Fred Stadler.
And by the way, assuming that listeners tonight are interested in early airplanes, I am just so thrilled with this Blériot that has been built here by our volunteer group. Fred's going to talk about it next month on the webinar, but if you haven't seen it with your own eyes, just wait till you come to Oshkosh. It looks fantastic, and we're going to try and put the first flight on it in the spring. And I actually got word yesterday. Hal, earlier you mentioned, one of the hats I wear here is the different features and attractions at Oshkosh, and I believe we're going to have an original 1911 Blériot at Oshkosh this summer that we'll be flying. So you have the opportunity to see a genuine 100-year-old airplane fly. Oh,
that's fantastic! That is spectacular. That is great news, and one of the very, very first announcements of one of our featured aircraft at AirVenture. That's a nice little pleasant surprise. Of course, subject to change, but great news. Wanted to just pass on a couple of other quick comments. Again, having to acknowledge, I haven't met him, but I feel like he's my new friend Neil, who's been with me all along here with some commentary and some very interesting insights. he said, I should, quote, I should own up that I'm a Brit living in France who speaks and reads fluent French and runs a business in California. So he wanted you to know, Adam.
So, I must have offended him at least 3 different ways.
I think at least 3 different ways. However, he followed that up immediately by saying, extremely good presentation and summary. Well done. Very interesting. And,
thanks, Neil.
So, and he also has mentioned this, that he has a friend who will be flying, or who was built and flown a Blériot, and that Neil himself was in the air over Calais on the 100th anniversary of Blériot's flight there. So that's great to see, and that people are celebrating that. And there's just a few other comments and bits of congratulations. I don't want to get too self-aggrandizing here, but we very much appreciate the feedback from everyone. And there's a question here, and I suspect that, with all due respect, boss, that you may not have a lot of information on this answer. And my suspicion is that really at this point maybe the world doesn't really know the answer. But for me it's a fascinating question, and I have a feeling it's going to nag at me for a while. And that is. And let me just find who had actually asked this. This was Gerard Peterson, who's asking if there's any records from anywhere in this era that we've been talking about, any records of any Chinese aviators. And he points out he's curious to the design of Chinese sails and figure the traditional sort of the Chinese junk, the boats, very, very much airfoil shaped, and certainly some remarkable early innovation in China around that time, but as a very closed society. So do you have any immediate insights or thoughts or any awareness there?
Well, no, I certainly haven't heard of any, but I think it is a fascinating question. One of the things I never mentioned was I suppose there still is the possibility that there may be some information buried somewhere. As I mentioned earlier, this guy Karl Jatho from Germany, well, nobody knew anything about him until the 1960s. So, who knows what information is sitting up there in someone's attic in China or in other parts of the world, that there may yet be something out there that's got some kind of evidence. I think the point I was trying to make is that it probably doesn't really mean it doesn't mean anything in historical terms, because if we haven't heard about it now, it definitely didn't have any impact on aviation development. But yeah, entirely possible that as China opens up, we may find some things. And I'm still thinking places like Russia. I know it's 20 years now since the wall came down, but there are still, I think, some pretty vast areas of archival information that maybe hasn't truly been trawled through yet.
Well, that'll be really interesting to watch and see if anything else comes out, because obviously that whole, as you've expressed so well tonight, that whole period was so rife with experimentation and just so many interesting things. Even I think even those attempts that were furthest from success, I think there's still something any of us can learn from that, about that spirit of innovation and experimentation.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I regret, because the focus of the presentation was on some of these claims of powered flights. There's a whole bunch of people that never even got a mention this evening, like Octave Chanute and Lawrence Hargrave and people like that. And these were really phenomenal people. First of all, in what they did. Octave Chanute there down in Chicago, he was experimenting himself with hang gliders, but he was almost like this one-man internet that information passed through. So he would correspond with the Wright brothers and in Dayton, and the folks in France, and Hargrave in Australia, and he would sort of connect all this information together. And I think the role he played was really important. Hargrave's box kite was a great breakthrough in terms of its design and shape, and I'm pretty sure that Chanute got that information to the Wright brothers, and they incorporated it in the design of their wings. And so there were some really great people out there that never even got a mention in the presentation because they, what they did. But yeah, if there's one point, hopefully I did successfully communicate this evening, is don't imagine the airplane just popped out of the sky. I think from the latter part of the 1900s, the 19th century, there was just this growing feeling, this growing belief that flight was possible, and maybe the population of people in the world was a couple of hundred people trying to get there first.
Well, it sounds so trite to say, but I don't think there's anyone listening tonight or anyone anywhere in our membership anywhere in the world that isn't so very, very glad that they did. Absolutely. So I tell you what, that basically brings us to the end of the questions, and I've managed to recreate a second and hopefully corrected version of the poll question. So why don't we go ahead and put that up again? Just do a bit of creative clicking here. Okay, so I put the question up, and I figured out how to restrict the choices as well. So the question is, do you think there were any successful, powered, controlled, sustainable, heavier-than-air flights before the Wrights in 1903? And I realize it's a bit unfair to have tweaked the wording of the question before and after, but this is certainly non-scientific. So the intent, the spirit of it is to see where people's minds are before and after, and the responses available to them, Adam, are now just yes, no, or undecided. So we're watching people vote quite a bit, and again, with my what I had missed in the first question was really the emphasis on the controlled and the sustainable. So I'd gone with successful, powered, heavier than air, thinking I was ahead of the game. We're going to give people just another moment to wind those down. One very, very quick aside from me, Adam, when you're talking about Santos-Dumont, is as you well know, having worked with them and with me on that project quite a bit, when Microsoft produced the Century of Flight edition of Flight Simulator, the version that was sold in Brazil was actually required by Brazilian law to include an add-on aircraft, an extra disc sort of shrink-wrapped to the package with Dumont's 14 Beasts airplane added onto it, and some additional text and the ability to recreate that flight. And that had to actually be on the front of the box, sort of obscuring and sort of taking precedence over the Wright brothers, or the product would not have been allowed to have been sold in the country of Brazil.
I didn't know that. That is fascinating.
Okay, looks like 84% of the people have voted, and that's looks like they're just about to sort of stop trickling in, and definitely a different percentage than what we saw at the beginning. Again, with the acknowledgement of some tweaks in wording to the question that I take responsibility for. So anyone before the Wrights, 82% now say no, 7% remain undecided, and 11% say yes. So we've got 11% out there, and I'd be very curious to hear from those folks about who, is there somebody that we've missed tonight? Do they know something that we don't? So when there's some times for commentary in the survey as you close out, if you've got some additional info or something that we ought to follow up on, and let us know. That's pretty interesting to me.
That's probably a reasonable reflection of worldwide opinion. I think the large majority is with the Wright brothers, with a healthy slice of skepticism out there, which is probably never a bad thing in society.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think on that note, now we see 92% of the people have voted, and the percentages are just about the same. 82% no, 11 yes, and 7 remain undecided. So with that, I think we will wrap it up for the night. We'll pause the recording here in just a moment. Adam, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I would like to wish England cricket team every success in their game against Australia today. How about that?
That's fantastic, and I'm sure at least Neil joins you in sharing those sentiments as a Brit, and I, of course, want what you want, sir, but in my own best interest. So Neil said, Adam, you are a romantic. That's very, very good and hopeful. So with that, with thanks to Adam, uh, oh, I'll share some of the rest of these comments with you offline, Adam. How's that?
Okay.
But with thanks to you, Adam, and for the great presentation, the great content tonight. Thanks so much to those of you who signed up and registered.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
And best of British luck to the cricketers and the Ashes and all of that. And with that, thank you again, everyone, and good night.